I hope everybody is well and safe. And if you haven't had your vaccination, that you are on a schedule. We were talking earlier that many people have, and I get mine tomorrow. As I mentioned earlier, I never thought in all my life, I've been stuck with the needle many times, but I never thought I'd be so excited to be stuck with the needle as I am going tomorrow, and finally did it. So in that regard, things are, I guess, are looking up. Today's Drama and Literature is hosting our meeting. And Vicki, if you would like to proceed and introduce our guest speaker, appreciate it.
Okay, do you want us to do that or is that first? Okay.
Yes.
They're not going to unmute anybody.
Jennifer Adair.
Yeah.
Can you just wave to everybody so they can see you?
Hello.
And then when you speak, we'll put you on speaker.
Okay.
Speaker view. So thank you so much for agreeing to do this, Jennifer. We really appreciate it. This is Jennifer Adair. She is the daughter of our member, Nancy Adair. And Jennifer grew up in Plainsboro. She went to Stewart Country Day and graduated. And then she went on to get her BA at Vassar College in her degree in history and Latin American studies. Is that right, Jennifer?
That's correct.
Okay. And then she received her PhD at NYU. Reading it. Where she specialized in Latin American history, and she is the author of the book In Search of the Lost Decade, Everyday Rights in Post-Dictatorship Argentina. And it took her 5 or 6 years to write the book.
A lot of years.
A lot of years. And she has traveled extensively and lived in Spain, Paraguay, Chile, Argentina. And she met her husband while she was in Argentina. They now live in Manhattan, and they have a 2-year-old son, Emilio. And,
Elio.
what is it?
Elio.
Oh, Elio. Oh, I'm sorry.
No worries.
And she's visited Cuba 3 times for educational purposes with Fairfield University to write curriculum. And we just finished a book, a historical fiction on Next Year in Havana, it's called. So while we were discussing that, or before, when we were doing our planning, Nancy suggested that her daughter had been to Cuba so many times and that maybe she could speak for our general meeting. So she has agreed to share with us and explain what it's like to write, comparing historical fiction, and she writes fiction. And that entails a lot of differences, and she has a lot of good things to tell us. So I'd like to introduce you to Jennifer Adair. And thank you. And I just want to say one thing. If you'd like to see Jennifer a little better, on your screen, put your little view at the very top of your screen. You'll see a square on the right hand top corner, and it shows you 2 views. You can either do gallery view or speaker view. If you click on speaker view, then you'll get a full-on face of Jennifer. And also mute yourself so we don't hear phones ringing, dogs barking, and all those other things.
All right. Thank you so much, Vicki, for that introduction. And thank you so much for the invitation to be here today. My mom has told me so much about your club. And I know how important it has been for her, and I'm sure for everybody, especially this past year. So it's a real honor to be here today. And thank you for inviting me into this Zoom space. As Vicki mentioned, I'm a historian of Latin America, and I am a professor of Latin American history at Fairfield University in Connecticut. I'm also, as Vicki mentioned, the author of this book, which she mentioned. It's called In Search of the Lost Decade, Everyday Rights in Post-Dictatorship Argentina. mouthful of a title, but the book is about Argentina's transition to democracy in the 1980s. The book came out last year, right before the pandemic began. So I was happy to be able to, I had a little bit of a book party and a celebration. So I'm glad that that was able to happen. As Vicky mentioned, I am also Nancy Adair's daughter. And I would say that my mom is my biggest fan and my best reader. So important things to mention there as we get started for today. My mother also told me something that Vicky, you mentioned, that in your book club, you read a lot of historical fiction. I absolutely love historical fiction. She talked to me about the book that you just read that took place in Cuba. And she also told me that you've talked a lot about how to write a book that takes place in another place and another time, and some of the differences between historical fiction and kind of more traditional history books as well. And for me, as a professional historian, one of the big differences that I see between history and historical fiction is the writer's relationship to sources and to archival research. A writer of historical fiction is able to take a lot more liberties to bring the past to life. I'm sure there are many people on this call who might be fans of The Crown, the Netflix series all about the British royal family. I am a super fan of that show, and I think it's a wonderful example of historical fiction. The writers of that show have invented characters, romances, they've made up dialogues that maybe sort of happened, but maybe didn't. But altogether, those details really bring to life a different time and a different place. And they contain a lot of historical truths, even if they're not exactly accurate in terms of what happened on such and such a date or with specific people. After every episode of The Crown, I come away with knowing a lot more about the British royal family and wanting to know more as well. But as a professional historian, I can't take the liberties that the writers of The Crown can, as much as I would like to. I have to make sure that my writing and my research is faithful to the sources, to the archives, and perhaps most importantly, to the individuals that I base my research on. When I was writing this book, I did several years of research in Buenos Aires, as Vicky mentioned, and as my mother can also remember. That research took me to the basement of government buildings filled with rickety shelves that reached to the ceiling. It took me to the dusty old back rooms of newspaper offices that nobody had been in several years. But I also met with former government ministers in their fancy apartments. I met with other people in some of the most elegant cafes in Buenos Aires. Some government ministers gave me documents that nobody had ever seen. And as my mother also probably clearly remembers, this research involved a lot of pounding the pavement to try to get anybody to talk to me, especially as a foreigner and as a non-Argentine. And sometimes, as my mom will remember, it involved a lot of frustration and tearful phone calls back home as well. But it was also really exciting to do this research and to be one of the first people to study this particular period of Argentine history. So I thought if you would indulge me for a few more minutes that I would talk a little bit more about my work in Argentina, what my book is about, and then open the floor to discussion, any questions that you have. I would say growing up in Plainsboro, I was one of those kids that was always interested in history. I loved history from a very, very early age. And I double majored in history and Latin American studies in college. A few years after college, I received a fellowship to Argentina to work with a human rights organization called Memoria Abierta, which translates to open memory in English. This was an organization that was dedicated to creating a museum of memory about the experience of the dictatorship that ruled Argentina from 1976 to 1983. The dictatorship here in the United States is sometimes referred to as the Dirty War. I'm not sure how much people know about Argentina, but Argentina is a nation that has a long history of military dictatorships. But the military regime that ruled Argentina during the 1970s was definitely the most brutal dictatorship that had ever ruled Argentina. And it left behind a terrible legacy of state terror. Some human rights groups estimate, for example, that up to 30,000 people were kidnapped, tortured, and then murdered by the military regime. So this is still a period that really reverberates in daily life in Argentina today. I arrived for the first time to Argentina in the year 2004, so long after the dictatorship ended. But it was still a really important moment in Argentina. Just 3 years before I arrived to Argentina, in December of 2001, Argentina had defaulted on its debt, a debt of about $95 billion. Argentina was no longer able to pay its debts. And this was one of the largest defaults in history up until that point. And overnight, Argentina's economic collapse plunged about half of all Argentines into poverty, basically overnight. It was a tremendously chaotic and very painful period of recent Argentine history. So I arrived to Argentina in the midst of this terrible economic crisis that was still ongoing. And I began to witness that Argentines were beginning to make these explicit connections between the past and between the present, between the economic crisis of the early 2000s and the repression and the fear of the dictatorship period. Argentines all seemed to agree that there really hadn't been a full reckoning with the dictatorship period or with the transition to democracy that followed. People began to say that the only way that Argentina could really move forward was by coming to terms with its history, by understanding the past. So that's how I first got interested in my book project. I wanted to know more about the legacies of the dictatorship period in Argentina, and specifically how it transitioned back to democracy. So I decided to return to graduate school to find out what happened. And when I started graduate school at NYU, I was really surprised to find out that nobody had written this history yet. Nobody had written this history about the end of the dictatorship in Argentina yet. No historian had tried to come to terms with Argentina after the dictatorship ended. So my focus sort of quickly shifted away from the dictatorship period proper to understanding what came after. I got more interested in that question of how does a society emerge from such terrible violence? How do you rebuild a society after such violence? Is it possible? And what role did human rights actually play? And so I jumped into studying this period that academics like to call the transitions to democracy in Latin America. And a big part of my book focuses on the government of Raúl Alfonsín. He was the first president of Argentina elected after the military dictatorship. Some Argentines consider him still the father of democracy in Argentina to today. And I got really intrigued by one of his most famous campaign slogans. When he was running for president, he said that with democracy, one eats, one is cured, and one is educated. Wow, I thought, that was a really great way to describe the ways that Argentines understood the connections between the end of the dictatorship and their hopes for a new democracy that could make sure that people's needs were met after this terrible period of violence and fear. And I really loved that slogan by Alfonsín, right? With democracy, one is cured, educated, and healed. And so I decided to focus my study of Argentina after the dictatorship on a specific part of that phrase, on food as kind of a human right. Some of you may know that Argentina was once considered the breadbasket of the world. Argentina is known for its really delicious wines, its excellent steaks, and for its fertile lands that Argentines have long prided themselves as being able to feed the citizens of the country and indeed the world. Argentina at one point was the world's largest producer of wheat and meat. But when the dictatorship ended, Argentines were hungry. The military regime didn't just kill its opponents, it also made them poor and hungry as well. And so I saw food as a way to open up the history of the end of the dictatorship in Argentina. We know that food can tell us so much about history. I'm sure all of us have family stories about the importance of that particular recipe or that particular meal that you associate with one moment in your life or a bigger moment in time as well. And I saw food as being really important to understanding the post-dictatorship as well. I was one of the few people to study Argentina's food program. I looked into food scandals and I investigated food riots that ended up forcing the president of Argentina from office early. And altogether, this focus on food helped me to better understand what transitioning to democracy meant for ordinary Argentines, what it might have been like to live after the military dictatorship. And I found that what most Argentines wanted after the end of military rule was the right to live a life of dignity, a life that could ensure people's physical safety, meaning that they would be free from the threat of violence, but a life where their bellies would also be full and where their needs would be met. So I've talked for a few minutes right now, and I'm much more curious to hear your questions or your comments about either the book or the research process in general. And I want to thank everybody again for having me here today.
Just want to remind everyone that everyone is muted. So if you have a question, lower left corner of your screen, unmute yourself if you have a question.
I have a question. Jennifer, what prompted you to, early on in your life, study Latin American studies?
What prompted that? That's a great question, and one related to my family history as well. I think I'm not sure. I was adopted when I was a baby, and my parents were always very open about that. And my mom knew that my biological father was from Cuba, and growing up, that was a big part of, I think, what my mom and dad wanted me to know about my personal origins. And I think it was what first got me interested in history, and then the region itself, kind of understanding what Latin America, this vast place just below the United States, meant. And I related it to some parts of my own personal history. And my parents really encouraged that. They were the ones to say, you know what, you're interested in this? Try to study abroad. And as a high school student, I was able to study abroad in Paraguay, a place that not many Americans go. And that really, I think, was probably one of the most formative moments of me saying, hey, I love this region. I love this history. And in some way or another, it's going to be a part of what I do with my life. Thanks for that question, Anne.
Jennifer,
Mm-hmm.
I wondered, how is the economy present day in Argentina, and how are they handling the pandemic?
Oh, that's a terrific question. I see Peter, Kathy. I'm imagining you're Kathy here. So thanks for that question, Kathy. Argentina is also a nation that has frequently faced pretty catastrophic economic crises. And in moments of global emergencies, like the one that we're living right now with the pandemic, Argentina has often bore the brunt of pretty severe economic downturns. So this past year, since the pandemic has begun, Argentina is once again in the midst of a pretty dire economic crisis. The pandemic has hit Latin America very hard. at the beginning of the pandemic, Argentina had one of the more strict lockdowns in the world. You weren't able to go out of your house. My husband's mother, my mother-in-law, was housebound. Really could not leave her apartment for 4.5 or 5 months. And that ended up having the effect, it kept people safe for a very long time, but it also had pretty catastrophic economic impacts as well. It remains to be seen how Argentina will once again climb out of this pandemic, but it has resulted in more people going hungry and more poverty as well. It doesn't, I'll say this, Kathy, it doesn't look that optimistic right now. But one thing I do know about studying Argentine history is that Argentines are probably some of the most resilient people that you will ever meet and know as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. I see
I'm-
Colleen waving there. Go
Yeah.
ahead, Colleen.
I have a question. First of all, I read the book. I just finished it yesterday.
Oh, wow.
And it was very interesting, something I knew absolutely nothing about. And the fact that you brought the food story in made it very much more accessible as a,
Oh, thank you.
basically a fiction reader. I'm not a big
Yeah.
reader. So that was that part. I love the food riots.
Oh, yeah, me too. Me too. My goodness, I hope I didn't put you to sleep with the book because it's not historical
It
fiction.
was fascinating, which brings me to my question. Two questions really. Number one, are there any is there any historical fiction covering that same period, because it's
Yeah.
such a interesting period? And then more generally speaking, you said you were also a historical fiction reader.
Yes.
Do you know of a, do you have a methodology, like if you say, whatever, pick a time, pick a period and say, I want to find a book about that. Do you Google it, or is there, do you know of any?
How do I go about doing that in that way? That's a great question as well. What I typically do to sort of find, you mean sort of finding new works of?
Yeah.
Sometimes I start with my colleagues, I gotta say. I go to my colleagues in the history department. I'm not sure if anybody here, that show Game of Thrones a few years ago was very popular, right? And it takes place in what seems to be kind of a fictionalized England in some places. And I got very interested in that. So I was able to talk with my colleagues to turn me on to historical fiction about Tudor era England, for example. So I rely on colleagues for that as well. But in terms of methodology, word of mouth as well, and other historian friends is how I sort of do it. I have to say I'm not a huge fan of this, but Amazon can sometimes be a great resource for giving. For giving.
But any good novels about?
Yes. About this period of Argentina. Yeah, there's a few. So I'm gonna there's a novel called Saint Evita, and I'm gonna look up the exact name of the author right now as we are. The author's name is, and if you know what I can do, I will put the name of the author in the chat right now. There's a wonderful translation of a book by an author named Tomás Eloy Martinez. He wrote kind of a classic novel of contemporary Argentina that I think in English is translated as Saint Evita.
Okay.
For those of you people who don't know much about Argentina, probably have heard the name Evita, right? So this, it is a wonderful, wonderful novel that follows the history of Evita's life, but what also happened is a little bit dark, but what happened to her body after she died. And the author is just able to open up a whole new world of understanding Argentina, palace intrigues, why Evita was such a flashy and charismatic figure in the first place. That's one of my top picks for Argentine fiction. You could put it maybe as a candidate for your book club. Like, I know you guys have, but it's a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful book as well. That would be my top pick, Colleen, for contemporary Argentina.
Thank you very much.
Sure, thank you. Thank you for reading the book. Gosh, that's
Great.
wonderful. Thank you.
I have a question.
Yes.
The quote, cured, educated, and healed.
Yeah.
Who said that? Who's the author of that?
That was basically a campaign slogan that was invented or written by Raul Alfonsine. I'm going to type his name also in the chat so people can see how to spell his name. Raul Alfonsine. He was the first president elected as president in Argentina after the dictatorship period. And again, as I mentioned in my comments, I really like that quote. And I would say that Alfonsine was one of those politicians, those rare politicians, who really had his pulse on what Argentines hoped for democracy. Argentines were very, very interested in prosecuting the military for their crimes. But again, they were also really interested in making sure that they would be able to live a life where they wouldn't go hungry, where they would be safe. And so he really tapped into that, and that became sort of his most famous slogan.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marcia.
I have a question.
Yeah.
You studied Latin American, but how does that, you also went to Cuba, so
Yes.
how do they compare?
How do they compare? That's great. I've been lucky enough to travel to Cuba a few times and at very different stages. Each time I went was related to kind of education and research purposes, which has been the way that Americans have been able to travel to Cuba. And Cuba, as we all know, has played a big role in U.S. political life as well. The Cuban Revolution, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Bay of Pigs invasion. We know it all. Elian Gonzalez, that people may remember from, you know, that was probably one of the more recent sort of scuffles between the U.S. And Cuba. And I was lucky enough as a college student, as a senior in college, all the way back in 1999, to be one of the first student groups allowed back into Cuba. And it was another one of those formative trips as well. Cuba isn't very... All countries in Latin America have their own special characteristics, of course, and their own national histories. But Cuba, because of its relationship with the United States, really stands out in Latin America. Cuba is a small island that has long been a thorn in the side of the United States for many reasons, to sort of put it lightly. And I think it's a fascinating place. In fact, my husband and I, once this pandemic is over and we all get our shots, we'd like to go to Cuba for our first sort of family vacation with our son. Cuba is a land of contradiction, a land of mystery in so many ways in terms of its history, and it's a place that I think is often misunderstood in the United States as well. The Cold War had a lot to do with it, right? But I think Cuba has a lot to teach us as well about how to organize social life, how not to organize social life as well. I'm not sure if that answers your question, Vicky.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
This is Anne.
Hi, Anne.
I'm not sure. You mentioned a human rights group that you got a fellowship to go to Argentina.
Mhm.
Are you currently involved with other human rights work?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks for that. And for many years, I collaborated with that organization, Open Memory, which is a leading human rights organization in Argentina. I worked with them on everything from translation projects to the organizing conferences for other human rights activists in Latin America. After I finished my PhD, my work with them sort of dwindled dwindled because of other sort of professional obligations. But because of my research into sort of modern Argentine history, I'm still very connected to colleagues that work in human rights in Argentina, as is my husband and many of his friends as well. There are still human rights organizations absolutely dedicated to uncovering the truth about what happened during the dictatorship period. There are still human rights trials ongoing to convict those military officers responsible for the violence of the dictatorship period. So this is very much, to your question, Anne, a living history. It hasn't ended by any means in Argentina.
I have a question.
Mhm.
I was wondering how easy it was for you to gain access to libraries and archives when you were going to do your research.
Thanks for that question, Kirsty. Hard. It was, I'll say it in a word, and I was not joking when I talked about tearful phone calls to my mom as before I kind of figured out things. Argentina is notorious for having very, very difficult archives. You gotta know somebody. You gotta write a very sort of, please, Your Highness, I would love the opportunity to have the honor to take a look at the. It's very deferential. Archivists think of their archives as sort of their own private kingdoms in many ways. So I learned very quickly what to say and what not to say to try to gain access. So access, one, is a problem. But the other problem that I came up against was that traditionally in Argentina, once a government leaves power, oftentimes officials will either take home their archives and put them in a closet to never see them again, or destroy them. So I mentioned that I studied a food program in Argentina. It was the largest food program in Argentine history. Think of it kind of like a food stamps program, right? A massive, massive welfare program. The records were all thrown out at the end of the 1980s. So there was no trace of what had been this kind of like really big political initiative. And so I had to get really creative about how I would find a way into this history that interested me. And it happened slowly in fits and starts. I would get a contact who would lead me to another contact, who would lead me to another contact, and then I might get some documents that helped me. One story that I love telling was that in the book, I was able to rely on a lot of documents from the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church is not a state or a government archive, right? And the Catholic Church keeps very good records, I learned over the course of my research. So I was able to use church archives as a way to get into some of these questions that I was interested in. And I got a tip about a church archive in the outskirts of Buenos Aires. So I remember one day I got up really early. I took the 4 buses to get to the church. I'd made an appointment with the priest who was sort of in charge of the archives. He welcomed me very, very graciously. And he brought me into this foyer. And I saw that we were in a foyer that had like 3 doors said kitchen. The other door said administrative offices. The other door said archive. And I was like, oh, I need to get into that archive door. That's the door. And he turned to me and he said, we're happy to have you. I just have one question. Are you a believer? And I was a good Catholic schoolgirl. So I said, yes, I was a good Catholic schoolgirl. And in 5 minutes, I was in the archive. So, those kinds of things happened, right? Over the course of my research. I never thought it would be like that. I think when I started research, and maybe this is something that's helpful for sort of the way that you all think about the books that you read as well, that, so often in life, when we try to find something or investigate something, there's never one place that will give you all the answers, right? There's never one box that's going to be like, here is the treasure trove that will tell you all about Argentina. You got to put that stuff together. And part of writing history and writing fiction is putting that story together, choosing the details that are the most interesting, choosing the details that might be interesting, but might not actually help you tell the story that you want to do. And in part, that's why it took me so darn long to write the book. It was, putting together those pieces takes a long time. And Argentina does not make it easy. I will say that. Thanks for
I
that
have a
question,
question.
Kirsty. Sure,
What is the
Elaine, yeah.
status of women in Argentina? Are they, is it equal to men, or is it mainly a male-dominated society?
That's a terrific question, Elaine. I would say more and more, it is a society where there is equality between men and women. Argentina has very, very powerful women's movements that fight not only for things like equal pay, for equal work, but also against domestic violence, which has been more and more denounced. People are probably familiar with the Me Too movement here in the United States. Argentina has had a similar movement over the past 7 years or so. To your question, Elaine, though, I would say historically, Argentina has been a very male-dominated society, and that actually with the transition back to democratic rule, there have been women have taken a much greater part in political life. In fact, Argentina's president for 8 years, from 2007 to 2015, was a woman. Yeah, and she's now the vice president again. So pioneering in many ways, but still a long way to go. Thanks for that question, Elaine.
I wonder about the ethics that you follow as an historian and what you see with reporters who are supposedly presenting the truth, and how can we, are there other than working at a certain newspaper outlet, is there anyone who's really controlling them so that it's the truth that when you read it?
That's such a wonderful question, Joan. Historians and journalists have a few things in common. When we work, we are by our professional duties, really committed to being faithful to the sources that we read, the sources that we find, and also the individuals that we talk to. In my professional world of history, I guess maybe fact checking or accountability might work a little bit different in both of these fields. Reporters have editors that they report to. Reporters have readers that they report to as well. As a professional historian, I sort of report to my peers. My book, so this book was read before it was published by three readers who I knew, who the press contacted, in addition to 2 other anonymous readers, all of whom read my work, very attentive to my arguments, to how I used the sources, to how I wrote the book as well, and who made judgments really about its worthiness in terms of publication. So the people that read my, when I finished my book, I sent the book off to the University of California Press, which is a great publisher for academic Latin American history. And I was very excited to work with them. Once they had my manuscript in hand, it was my editor's job to find readers who could say, okay, Jennifer Adair did her due diligence. She worked with innovative sources. She's contributing something new to history, and therefore it is worthy of publication. So I am accountable to my peers, and it's actually kind of a rigorous process. I turned in my manuscript. Another fun anecdote of the book was I turned in my manuscript the day before my water broke. The book and my son were always very, very related, but I remember I pushed send, and within 24 hours I was in the hospital. So with my son on the way. But from that moment, from pushing send, having my kid, and getting comments back from, again, colleagues of mine contacted by my editor, it took about 4 or 5 months. So it's something that's taken very, very seriously. To your question, Joan, I think, journalism works in a similar way, but as we know, standards for journalism have really shifted over the past few years. There is really less accountability, in part because of the internet, because of the availability of different platforms, right? And also I'd say because of polarization of politics in the United States, that journalistic rigor has shifted a little bit. But as an academic, I'm accountable to my peers who really do hold me accountable.
Well, thank you.
Thank you, Joan, for that question. Hi, Pat.
Hi. I spent maybe 5 days in Buenos Aires right about the time of the economic downturn.
Okay.
And it is a beautiful, beautiful city. That Champs-Élysées kind of right down the center of the city. But it was really disappointing to see how these beautiful, beautiful buildings were in such disrepair. Yeah. Has there been any effort to renovate?
To renovate. Thanks for that question, Pat. I agree with you. Buenos Aires is a city that dazzles,
Yes, it's just beautiful.
It's really hard not to fall in love with the city. And I will admit that one of the reasons why I ultimately chose to study Argentina was because I fell in love with the city the first time that I visited. And in part, I think you're making a really good point. In part, the economic crises that Argentina frequently faces takes its toll. It takes a toll on the physical look of the city. And so there are pockets of Buenos Aires, however, where there's been a lot of cash put into renovating spaces. In particular, the old historical center. Yeah. I'm sure you might have been gone to, if you recall, San Telmo, the old sort of antique neighborhood. In the years after the economic downturn, there has been a lot of attention to historical renovation and just sort of rebuilding that. In part, I think, because the Argentine government knows that is a place for tourism revenue, right? And that it behooves them to do this kind of renovation. But I would say, Pat, that it's still kind of spotty. For those, some people might have also been to Buenos Aires, but it really does, you said the Champs-Élysées, it does have this kind of Parisian feel, and that was by design. Yeah. Buenos Aires' city planners looked to Paris and they said, we are going to make this city the Paris of the South. And you can see that sort of throughout the city. Thanks, Pat.
Francis.
Hi, Hannah.
Oh. Well, that's okay. That's all right. I use my granddaughter's name when I Zoom.
Gotcha.
So
all righty.
So I'm Fran.
Hi, Fran.
Maybe I'm generalizing, but why? It seems to me that many countries in South America have had dictatorships. Why is, I mean, maybe it's too general a question for you. Why does it, I mean, to me, it should be a richer country. I mean, with all its resources, etc. Why were they prone, or if I'm being too harsh, I'm sorry, but why were they prone to that?
Yeah. Fran, do you want to start a PhD in Latin American history?
No, thank you.
I gotta say that is the question of modern Latin American history.
Well, so there's a second one for you. There's a second one for you.
You're right in the main question. So I will be honest with you. So I've dedicated my life to studying Latin America, and I'm not going to give you a satisfying answer. I've got a few thoughts about that, though. I'll be honest. I know my limitations. The question you asked is a brilliant one, and it is the question that most people interested in Latin America ask. How can a region that is some of the most resource rich in the world, some of the most beautiful, some of the most vibrant, have seen so much violence in their history? I have two sort of ways that I help my students work through that. And I think you got to look at history first. Latin America, in addition to being this wonderfully rich and beautiful place, is also a place that was founded in conquest, in the Spanish conquest, right? And I know you can't make such a general rule that from Christopher Columbus on, it explains dictatorships, but that legacy of colonization in which Latin America was often not in control of its own future took its toll. It took its toll economically, and it took its toll in terms of political stability, making it, I think, very vulnerable to frequent forms of military intervention as well. I'll add on to that a little bit more. Maybe this is a little bit more controversial, but the United States has often looked at Latin America as a place where it could intervene, or it could insert itself perhaps more than it should. And I think that that also plays a big role in understanding the vulnerability of Latin America to military uprisings. Does that make sense, Fran?
Yes, it does,
Yeah.
because having taught high school history, we do know that many companies went into
Yes.
South America, used their resources, did take advantage of the workers.
Yeah.
You know, the men in power were making the money, but those in the factories were not.
Yeah.
So that can very well be a cause, unfortunately.
And I think that is the dynamic that you see over and over and over. You mentioned high school and companies. I'm wondering if you're talking about the United Fruit Company and bananas.
Yes, Banana Republics.
Okay, Banana Republics. Yeah. Exactly, right? And so I teach about Banana Republics. And one of the things that I often ask I'm wondering if folks are familiar with that term, Banana Republic. And so I see some people shaking their head. Yeah, it's sort of, yeah. A lot of times we use that term Banana Republic as kind of an insult, right? To describe a country that is corrupt, that's unstable. And I often tell my students, I say, okay, let's break that down a little bit. Yeah, you can call a country a banana republic, but you also got to understand the forces and other nations involved in kind of ensuring that those banana republics exist, whether that be powerful governments or companies like the United Fruit Company, right? That have a pretty big stake in making sure that that dynamic, right, of inequality, of exploitation continues. So there's a lot of that there.
Right.
Fran, you got to come to my classes.
Unfortunately, you're a little too far away. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you for the question.
I just had a quick comment about banana republics.
Yes.
I remember taking a trip into Costa Rica and going to a banana plantation. And if I recall, it was Gompers who came in and organized the labor and how different it was in that particular area.
Oh, wow. I'm unfamiliar with that.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
so interesting.
Frederick Gompers came in and organized this banana plantation area. It was on the east coast of Costa Rica. And they had little houses, they had electricity, they had little schools and stores and health, but it was just limited, I think, to that particular area. I don't think it had, well, I don't know. You probably would know better than I if it spread. They were so proud of this. They were very, very proud of this.
Oh, that's so interesting. So I'm not familiar with that particular case study, but one thing that I do know is that a lot of companies that went into places in Central America, Costa Rica or Honduras or Nicaragua, set up essentially kind of company towns, right? Where workers would be sort of bound to the banana plantation as well. And sometimes those workers would be organized, right? And they could be organized, sometimes with success and other times with very violent consequences as well. Yeah. Thank you for that. I wasn't familiar with that particular.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah.
Thank you.
That's funny. I'm from West Virginia, and the idea of owe your soul to the company store kind of thing, that rang a bell with me because we had mining towns, and they had little shack. I mean, they were nicely made shacks, and they had the company store, and they were, it was pretty much a way to keep them from organizing, I think.
Yeah.
And it was hard to walk away because your home, everything you had belonged to the coal company.
Yeah, I really appreciate that comment, Marcia. In part because, you know, as a historian of Latin America, I often try to challenge my students to think about the ways that Latin America and the United States might be more alike than different. And so that example that you give, I think, is a prime example of kind of similar dynamics at work, right? Where you know, coal country can look a lot like banana country as
Yeah.
well, right? And so I think you've really tapped into something that, and at the end of the day, yeah, there are things that are very different between North and South America, but there are shared histories in common, right? And shared experiences as well. I'm thinking about the question as well about women's movements as well. Those movements look a little bit alike as well across the Americas.
There's also the mothers. What is it?
Yeah.
The mother of Plaza de Mayo.
Yes. I'll say I'm not sure how many people are familiar with the Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo in Argentina, but I'll say a little bit about them. For people who've been to Argentina or know something about recent Argentine history, they will often turn and mention the Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo. The Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo is probably Argentina's leading human rights organization, founded by women whose children were disappeared by the military regime in the 1970s. As I mentioned before, you know, human rights activists estimate that up to 30,000 people were killed by the military regime. And one of the most sinister aspects of Argentina's military regime was that the regime denied that anybody had even gone missing. There was no place during the Argentine dictatorship to actually go. Courts were shut down. Police stations would not help you because they were aligned with the military regime. Public hospitals were not allowed to give out the names of possible victims as well. So there was really no place for families of victims of the regime to turn to. But more and more, as the dictatorship began, mothers would begin to encounter one another in their desperate searches for their children. They would end up running into the same people outside of police stations, outside of churches, outside of lawyers' offices. And little by little, these women decided, what happens if we join forces? What happens if we join forces to try to figure out what happened to our children? And because these women were mothers, women who on the surface didn't look like much of a threat to the military regime, at the end of the day, they ended up being the regime's worst enemy because they banded together and they argued, our children must be found. And we demand that you tell us where they are. And by the late 1970s, the Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo had done more than any other group in Argentina to shine a light on the brutality of the dictatorship. One of their most prominent acts is a weekly march. Every week, even to this day, the mothers, some of whom are in their late 90s, still meet every Thursday to walk slowly around a circle in the Plaza de Mayo, which is sort of, I guess it would be equivalent to sort of our White House in the United States. Demanding to know where their children are. Of course, with the pandemic, they are not meeting outside, but until the pandemic began, you could go every Thursday afternoon in Argentina to see these trailblazing women keeping up the fight for their children. It's a very, very moving story as well. And they were just on the front lines of demanding the truth and of demanding accountability. And they still are.
I hate to be so ignorant, but how long did that military junta, I don't know what to call it, last?
It lasted for 7 years, 7 years. And again, I mentioned Argentina had a long history of military dictatorships, and some dictatorships that actually lasted longer than 7 years. But this dictatorship in the 1970s, though it wasn't the longest, it was definitely the most violent. It began in 1976 with an overthrow of the government, and it ended in 1983 with the election of Raúl Alfonsín, who I focus on in my book. Yeah, so 7 years. And since
Jennifer,
then go ahead.
no, go ahead.
No,
I
go
didn't,
ahead.
I have a question. With what's happening in Venezuela right now, do you see parallels to the situation that existed previously in Argentina? And has that situation in Venezuela impacted Argentina, and how?
Great question. Venezuela is probably the most controversial issue facing Latin America today. Some of you might know that Venezuela had been under the rule of a left-wing ruler named Hugo Chavez up until the early like 2011, before his death. Venezuela has since then really descended into kind of a very terrible situation under the government of Maduro, who's the president there right now. In the United States, I'm sure people have heard a lot about the food shortages and medicinal shortages in Venezuela as well. And it really truly is a humanitarian crisis facing Venezuela right now. But once again, it is an instance in which I think what we know about Venezuela from the United States doesn't always give us the full story. Now, I'm not in any way defending the Maduro government or the crisis there as well, but it's also important to recognize the role of the United States in I think, kind of exacerbating some of the existing crises in Venezuela as well. But to your question, I think it's an excellent question. Venezuela, because it is such a controversial issue in Latin America, has meant that other nations in Latin America have to take a stand on it, right? And Argentina is no exception. Argentina has historically supported Venezuela, though more and more, because of the deepening crisis, their humanitarian crisis, governments in Latin America are not turning their back on Venezuela, but they're more open about their criticisms of the regime there. Not sure if that answers your question.
It does. Thank you, Jennifer, and your presentation has been excellent.
Thank you so much for your question.
Any more questions? I have one more.
Sure, Vicki, yeah.
This one's personal.
Okay.
I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit, if you want to, how you met your husband.
Sure. So he's another outcome of research, I would say. I mean, so I met him in Argentina, actually. We had been part of similar circles of friends in Buenos Aires. I knew of him, he knew of me. We were both in, I'll get personal here, pretty yucky relationships before we met. And we're sort of friends, basically. I was doing my doctoral research when we met, and both of our respective relationships ended sort of around the same time. And as I was writing up my dissertation, I remember one of the first dates we had, he said, "So what do you think you want to do after this dissertation?" And I said, "Well, I want to become a professor. And like, I'm not doing this for nothing. I want to get a job teaching in a college." "Huh," he said. And within a year, we were living together in Maine, and I was starting my first academic job. So I never thought I would meet my husband writing my book, but that's how we met, and probably the best outcome of the research process as well. I have to say, and our son, of course, from that as well. So that's how we met. For my husband's part, I do not think he ever imagined that he would end up living with a gringa or an American, right, in New York City. That was just not in his plan at all. But here we are.
Thank you. That's wonderful.
Thanks for that question, Vicki.
Well, I don't know if you want me to wrap this up, or
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I can also just say my thanks and gratitude for inviting me to this space today. It's such a pleasure to come and meet with the group. It's such an important part of my mom's life, and to hear your wonderful questions. I hope you all consider Latin American studies in your future. I have to make that pitch as well. But I really appreciate your questions. They were so incisive and so really interesting. I love talking about this stuff, especially because I get to talk with people that are so curious and intelligent. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you. You
Oh,
must be a
Thank
wonderful
you.
teacher.
Thank you.
Wonderful teacher.
Very, very good. Very interesting.
Yes.
Thank you for taking the time to be with us, and really, I think your students are very, very lucky.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Oh, you should be, Mom.
Yes.
Very proud.
I'm surprised my mom didn't say anything this whole time. Look at you.
That's true. She did.
I was determined to be the good mom.
All right. You know you are. Thank you so much to everybody.
Thank
And
you.
I hope,
Thank you.
I can't wait to hear about your next meetings as well. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Take
Bye-bye.
care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.